every 50 seconds, a foreigner crosses the UK border to settle in Britain. That's the fastest rate in history.
A record 636,000 people moved to live in the UK last year. And when you take account of the people going in the other direction, net migration was 330,000. Now that's the highest figure ever and well over 3 times the government's official target.
If you only look at one graph to understand the NHS in England, this is the one to look at. This first line here, this shows you the change in the amount of money that we have paid to hospitals per procedure they carry out since 2009-10. And you can see it's gone down. Something for which we would have paid hospitals £100 back in 2009-10, we now pay them about £94. And the idea of that squeeze was that it would force hospitals to become more cost effective. So what happened to the costs faced by hospitals per procedure? Well, you can see from this line, first of all, things look pretty good. But since 2011-12, hospitals simply haven't kept pace with those fallen prices. The gap between those two lines, that's the NHS's financial problem. It means that hospitals are spending more per operation than they're receiving.
It gets cold here in winter, really cold. Many of these houses were built when Queen Victoria was on the throne. People used to wear as many clothes as they could inside their homes then to keep warm. Not that much has changed.
When did this bill go up to this price? Do you remember?
Just last month.
Don and his wife Joyce are retired and have got used to cold rooms. Despite their frugality, their heating bill has gone up to the equivalent of $2,500 a year.
Considering that when you're 80 they give you an extra 25 pence a week. Is that to cover the heating? In his pension, when he was 80, Don got 25 pence extra a week.
And your bill is this much?
Yes.
It's now virtually impossible in Britain for anyone to pay less than $1,600 a year for heating, regardless of income, with millions unable to afford that. The idea of competition in the fuel market
Schools up and down the country are facing the first real terms funding cuts in 20 years. That's according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. While school funding has been protected for the last 2 decades, the think tank's analysis suggests that spending per pupil will drop by 6.5% by 2019.
The reason behind the fall is that although there has been some protection in the overall level, it hasn't taken into account additional costs. So schools have been hit with additional costs of national insurance, pension contributions, and also local authority services have been hit by significant cuts. That money hasn't gone into the schools budget, that money has just gone, and therefore schools are having to provide services which they used to obtain possibly free of charge from their local authority. And the same is affecting academies and multi-academy trusts, because the Education Services Grant is being cut and they are having to fund those services from core budgets.
Children, they're worried about the oppression of civilians. When we talk to them now, either those same people or people who are going out much more recently, that narrative has completely been lost. They're saying we're here to establish an Islamic state. We don't care what the local people say. The land doesn't belong to them, it belongs to God. So you're seeing a much more hardline, much more callous attitude emerge.
Oh, so why that change, Douglas?
Well, part of it has got to do with the type of people going out there and the type of people attracted to it. There is always a certain type of person, the ideological component aside, there's always a certain type of person who relishes sadism and brutal violence. And
but this message particularly seems to be getting hold, or as you're saying, they've been supporting a caliphate for a very long time,
yeah.
but this is different.
Well,
Why?
yes, I mean, in the 1990s, for instance, when there was a lot of talk about, this among some extreme fringe groups in the UK like Hizb ut-Tahrir, it seemed like an impossible achievement. I mean, they always said that they wanted to make a worldwide Islamic state, but the striking thing in recent months is that the announcement that the Islamic State, the caliphate, has been put together has actually made that, what we all thought was a complete fantasy, into a kind of reality which they can join.
Is to do with Islam in a sense, because Islam was founded by the sword, let's face it. It really was.
It's not to do with Islam. It's not,
no,
what
I'm saying is it's attracting
no, come on.
people who want excitement and doing something.
Let's have a bit of clarity. This is not a British problem, and it's not an Islamic problem either. The fact is, if you look at the history of terrorism, it occurs particularly amongst young people. Baader-Meinhof, the Red Army faction, 1970, 1990, the things that happened in Cambodia, the things that have happened in China, the things that have happened in Kashmir again and again, and in Africa at the moment, young boy soldiers. So one of the issues is that this is the recruitment of youth at a time when they're probably their most disaffected, most easy to recruit. And so actually Miriam's got a really good point here, which it's a question of how you alter that in your society. In this case, we're facing a particular problem in our society, but it's certainly not a British problem.
In a moment, Douglas, because I want to bring in somebody who is a young Muslim man who does support the idea of a caliphate created by Islamic.
I can say is that Muslims, they cherish the Quran and the Sunnah, and for over 90 years we have been living without a caliphate, and many of the rules within the Quran can't be implemented. So now that we have this caliphate, I think you'll see many Muslims globally seeing it as an opportunity for the Quran to be fully realised and for justice to prevail everywhere.
What we're trying to get to, though, is some understanding of why some British young Muslims are listening to the IS voice and want to go over and fight there, and what can be done to stop it.
Could I just quickly, I mean, of course this is a young men issue. I mean, I think Doug's chronicled every single person in the US and UK who's been convicted of terrorism-related offences in this regard in the last 15 years. The overwhelming majority are young men. Of course we're dealing with young men. But you can't then ignore the fact that for them, whether you like it or not, whether we like it or not, for them, an interpretation of Islam is the reason that they are doing this. Now, you know, for us, this is the most appalling interpretation of Islam. For Muslims, it's the worst possible interpretation of Islam. But it is an interpretation, and that's why, you know, although it's more convenient for us to pretend that this has nothing to do with Islam, we do have to accept that it does in order for Muslims and others to fight against the interpretation that people like those in ISIS and indeed your loony guest here have, you know,
I don't think anyone's denying, Douglas, that there's a misinterpretation of Islam that
well,
people
an interpretation, whether it's a misinterpretation or not.
Fine. An interpretation by a fringe group is being spread. Absolutely, no doubt, and I don't think anyone's denying that. I think the critical issue is...
Hang on, let Miriam finish her point.
To get involved in any sort of crime or criminality, be that gangs or jihadism, and those factors tend to be linked to alienation, to poverty,
if I can just very quickly, I mean, every single young person at some point in their life feels alienation, feels disenfranchisement. Most people feel left out at some point, Miriam. I mean, most young people at some point. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And the problem we have in this country is that there is a large echo chamber of people who want to play into that perceived set of grievances. Let me give you one very quick example. Western foreign policy. We hear all the time, and your loony guest here just did it, the fact that British forces have been engaged in the Middle East is a reason for radicalisation. Let me put it this way. In the 1990s, we didn't get involved in the Balkans. And then we did. I have never heard one Muslim leader in this country say how much we are grateful to NATO for intervening in the Balkans and saving Muslim lives. In other words, the West is at risk. The West is at risk of being
intervention or non-intervention and what might be the risk.
Blamed when we intervene and when we don't.
I know. Let's take away their passports. Take away their British passports.
These young men. It won't help, unfortunately.
No.
George Kerry is an excellent man, but that's not going to make a fundamental difference.
No. So what makes the difference?
I have a huge respect for your organisation, which I think does really good work. But I think it's very worrying if we classify it as a problem of Islam, because I think that what we're seeing in Britain so much is real collaboration between different religious groups. Jews and Muslims, for example, probably are closer than they've been for a very long time in Britain. And the risk, I think, to community harmony is a very serious one. And so that's why we have to deal with some of the other problems we have in our society, which must be education, which must be poverty.
But we all want to deal with education and poverty.
Democracy.
Yes. All right. Yes. And one or two individuals, but I'm not even sure that this gentleman here would leave himself.
Would you leave, Abu?
Of course, I mean,
It's
if I
too
had a safe passage to the Caliphate, I'll be the first one on the plane to go to the Caliphate and live there.
But why don't you?
The sad reality is that the British
Why
government
don't you?
are
We'll
implementing
do a whip
oppressive
around.
policies,
Go on.
and they're arresting many Muslims at airports and preventing them from going to the Caliphate. So that is an issue that needs to be rectified.
It comes back to the point I just made about interventionism and about this country's foreign policy. There is such a wellspring of lies out there, which in the mainstream media and all sorts of places about what this country and our allies do. A very, very large wellspring of lies. It is very easy for young people of any political or religious background to seize on that and feel some kind of added resentment because of it. So we have to make sure that the narratives of what this country actually does, what this country actually is, are much better got out.
And it is about, isn't it, Douglas, getting that more positive message through and trying to quieten the negative stuff. But how do you do that?
What we tend to do, unfortunately, is, Lord Winston just did it earlier on, is the thing, because it's so uncomfortable, we don't want to have the discussion. Our societies are no longer very good at discussing religion, and here comes along a religion most people are unused to in this country, and we don't know how to discuss it. We'd rather not. The fact is there are some very uncomfortable things which Muslims globally have to deal with and have to globally have that internal discussion about. And we do not, I think, help that process. If we say it has nothing to do with the Quran, nothing to do with Muhammad, nothing to do with Islam, it does a little bit, or a major bit in some people's beliefs. It has something to do with that, and it's very important not to ignore that, because only by dealing with that can you actually take on the extremists. Otherwise, a young man like your lunatic guest earlier is very likely to have been told by people there's nothing in the Quran to justify this violence. He finds a verse given to him by an extremist that shows the behead the unbeliever, and then he thinks all these other people are lying to me. We have to take on things to stop that happening.
So we have
It was quite funny that Jeremy Corbyn, who's constantly derided for being a hopeless buffoon and on the edge of madness, has done something so straightforwardly sensible and is now being opposed by people whose attitude seems to me to be little short of crazy. The British public have voted to leave the European Union. If any party which now publicly stands to say we'd actually like to defy that decision is putting itself in a position of actual derision. You simply cannot do that. However you want to oppose what's happened at the referendum, if you want to oppose it, saying we don't accept this result and we're going to carry on sulking until you give us another cake, is not going to work. Jeremy Corbyn's decision was the only conceivable right one, and these poor desperate Blairites who've seen their whole raison d'etre seized by the Conservative Party, which is now the Blairite Party, don't know what to do. I think they should join the Conservative Party. It's where they belong. They'd be much happier there.
Okay, I'm not holding my breath for that, but we shall see.
The sensible things so seldom happen, but it would be the right thing.
Very well. No, I understand that. Rebecca, the issue of dispute here is whether that would be legal or not. Does it not make sense to establish the legality of that?
Well, the fact of the matter is that at present we simply haven't got a dispute. The British public have voted to leave the European Union. The Supreme Court has stated that it is up to Parliament, indeed the onus is upon Parliament, to confirm that vote. Once that has happened, Article 50 is entirely clear that the United Kingdom will notify the Council of its intention to withdraw.
But do you believe, I understand all that, that's the process and we've covered that. Do you believe Article 50 is irrevocable or not?
The text is quite clear. It proceeds on the assumption that when a country notifies its intention to withdraw, it means what it says.
Right, so you think it is irrevocable?
Well, it proceeds on the assumption that a country means what it says, just as when any country applies to join the European Union, negotiations for accession are conducted on the basis that that country too means what it says.
All right, but Lord Kerr, who's the man who actually is credited with writing Article 50, he told the BBC Article 50 is not irrevocable. If a country were to decide, actually, we don't want to leave after all, everybody would be very cross about it, but legally they couldn't insist that you leave.
Well, Article 50 doesn't provide any support for that view, and in any event, the issue hasn't arisen. I think legally speaking, the situation is entirely clear. The Court of Justice has ruled more than 30 years ago that it will not accept references on entirely hypothetical questions. The question or not whether the UK wants to reassess its intention to withdraw hasn't arisen yet. We haven't got a dispute. The European Court of Justice shouldn't even look at that.
All right, no, I understand that's your point. Julian Mom, the judgment in the Supreme Court of Article 50, it said Article 50 cannot be given in qualified or conditional terms, and that once given, it cannot be withdrawn.
I think it's a diversion. I think that the serious opponents of our departure from the European Union really need to start thinking in a more in a broader way. I don't want to offer them any particular advice. I don't want to help them, but it would seem to me that they have a much better prospect of frustrating our departure from the European Union by salami slicing it so much during the passage through negotiations in Parliament that what we end up with is that we move from being, as we are now, half out of the European Union to being half in it, which would seem to me to be the most likely result. But these legal diversions just seem to me to be trading on the success of the Supreme Court case, which was a notable success, but which didn't actually make much difference to the outcome of events, and trying to divert us from the centre of this, which is the negotiations between this country and the European Union, and what Parliament then does with those negotiations, which still seems to me to be a great deal of doubt.
Do you really think there's a cat's chance in hell that the government will change its mind?
The government is a political creature. If people change their minds, the government will change its mind. I think that is a very, very real possibility. Look, I recognise what the political mood is today. I'm not stupid. I read the papers. I listen to you. I watch daily politics religiously, of course.
Seriously deluded, isn't it?
But I also believe that the world is changing fast. I believe that there is a lot of evidence of what Brexit means that we are still yet to see. We don't even have a white paper. And I do think that it is very, very, very plausible that people will revise their views, and if they do, the government will follow.
Is it your view that the Dublin High Court is likely to pass this to the European Court, or do you feel the Dublin Court will throw it out?
Well, I think that's for the Dublin Court to decide. It should throw it out. I think the law is quite clear on that. We have a hypothetical question. It may be interesting, but a hypothetical question should not be referred. The matter is quite simple.
Can we all come to Dublin and watch this unfold?
At 33 years old, Tom Barlow thought he'd be on his way to owning a home in Manchester by now, but it is still very much a case of window shopping only, so he's renting instead.
When you do have a look in the estate agents and you do look at house prices, you do think it's unreachable. And it's not just me, it's just all of my friends, it's everyone that I know. And you know, we're all in a situation where unless your parents have got a large amount of money and can give you your deposit, saving for a deposit is just, you know, out of the question.
As cities like Manchester have boomed, home ownership has dropped from its peak just after the millennium to 1980s levels, wages lagging behind prices, high rents getting in the way of saving a deposit. Now, we're used to house price stories focusing on London, of course, but today's figures show just how much home ownership has fallen right across the UK in around the last decade. The biggest drop was here in Greater Manchester, down from 72% to 58%. Other double-digit drops were in West Yorkshire, where it fell from 70% to 60%, the West Midlands, 70% down to 59%, and Northern Ireland, a fall from 73% to 63%. Manchester City Council is developing mortgage guarantee and deposit savings schemes to help people get on the ladder. But the man running it all says maybe the bigger picture is changing.
Nobody's very clear yet as to whether or not we're seeing a cultural shift in this country where people actually make choices around renting rather than buying. I think at the moment there's still a deep psyche that you want to buy, but will that still be the same in the next 10 years? We're not really sure.
Many of those who do dream of buying question if they can make it a reality.
I do worry about my future ever having my own home. I guess I've had to try and get used to the idea that owning my own home may never happen.
And for Tom, every month's rent is another chunk of money gone that could have been put towards his own home. Peter Lane, 5 News.
if we take a penny to represent £100 million of debt, that would see you through about 7 hours worth of NHS spending. We can use that as a starting point for how big an issue this is. Now, back in 2005, at the end of that year, our national debt was around £490 billion. That's all the pennies in this jar. Since then, it's increased quite a lot, and that's because we've been borrowing more. So back in 2006, we borrowed £40 billion, and back in 2007, we borrowed another £40 billion. But then the financial crisis hit, and things got a bit trickier. 2008-9, borrowing shot up to 2 pint glasses worth, and £104 billion was borrowed, adding on to our national debt. And things got even worse the year after, as the government bailed out banks and supported the economy. 3 pint glasses worth, £155 billion worth of debt that year was added on. Now, in 2010, that came down a little bit. We'd had George Osborne's austerity budget, lots of cuts planned for the coming years. £140 billion almost was borrowed that year. And I think even a little bit more from that year added on then. Now, we're currently at, that's about £1 trillion worth of debt we're at by the start of 2011, and there was much more borrowing to come. As the cuts kicked in, the borrowing decreased a little bit this year, down to £116 billion, all piling on to the national debt that we've got to pay back at some point. In 2012-13, though, not part of the plan, borrowing actually increased a little bit, up to £123 billion that year. Things then started to come down quite a bit more as the economy improved. In 2013-14, £104 billion borrowed, still way more than before the financial crisis. And 2014-15, still £96 billion. George Osborne had hoped at one point that would be nothing. Now, last year, 2015-16, we still borrowed £76 billion. And if you take into account a few other costs, a few other loans that have gone on board over the last few years, it means that the current national debt is totalling £1.6 trillion. That's 16 with 11 zeros on the back of it. We've got to pay it back at some point. George Osborne's plan was to have an empty cup by 2020. But after Brexit, Philip Hammond and Theresa May think that can wait a little longer. So we're still going to be borrowing more money, and all that goes towards Philip Hammond's decision at the autumn statement this week.